The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that made the ICU look like a place where time moved differently than in the rest of the world. Megan O'Brien moved through Sacred Heart Hospital's intensive care unit with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory deeper than any nursing school diploma could teach, though no one here knew that. Her hands adjusted 4 lines with surgical precision, checking drip rates and fluid balances while her eyes tracked 3 monitors simultaneously. Bay 2 needed a fresh dressing on the femoral line. Bay 4's ventilator settings were drifting. Bay 6, the post-op cardiac patient, required another round of antibiotic labs. She noted each deficit without writing anything down. The data lived in her mind the way coordinates and casualty counts had once lived there, back when she was someone else entirely. The other nurses gave her space. Not the kind born from respect, though some of that existed too. This was the space people created around someone who flinched when a metal tray clattered to the tile floor, who sometimes stared out the break room window at nothing for 17 minutes straight, whose locker contained only 3 changes of scrubs and nothing personal. No photos. No birthday cards. No evidence that anyone outside this hospital knew her name. Megan was just the quiet nurse with hollow eyes and a 3-year employment gap that HR had stopped asking about. She moved like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, as if existing itself required permission. Dr. Marcus Hargrove watched her from the nurse's station, his observation far less benign. He stood with a coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips, his tailored white coat catching the institutional light in a way that screened expensive tailoring and inherited authority. 23 years he had run this unit. 23 years of making decisions without question, of establishing protocols that became gospel, of building a comfortable hierarchy where everyone knew exactly where they stood. And then Megan O'Brien had arrived 6 months ago, and something in that hierarchy had begun to shift in ways he could not quite articulate but could absolutely feel. She questioned things. Not loudly. Not confrontationally. But she questioned them, and worse, other people listened when she spoke. During this morning's rounds, she had suggested updating the sepsis bundle. The sepsis bundle. As if the protocols he had written in 2009 required updating. Her voice had been soft, almost apologetic, but the words carried a weight that made 3 residents lean forward. She referenced recent combat medicine findings, something about damage control strategies that had reduced mortality in trauma centers by 9%. Her hands had moved as she spoke, gesturing to the current antibiotic sequence, and he had seen the look pass between 2 of the younger nurses, a look of recognition, of understanding, as if she were speaking a language they had been dying to hear. Hargrove's jaw had tightened. He had cut her off mid-sentence. Stick to taking vitals, O'Brien. The fluorescent light above them had buzzed in response, as if the building itself had flinched. Now, watching her check the 4 on the dialysis patient, Hargrove calculated. She moved with the kind of certainty that did not belong in a floor nurse. The way she adjusted the clamp on the line showed a hand that had done this 10,000 times, and her eyes held something he could not name. Confidence, yes. But something else beneath it. Something that suggested she had done harder things than this. He opened her personnel file on his laptop, the cursor hovering over her employment history. 3 years as a floor nurse at Sacred Heart. Before that, a gap. 18 months with no record of employment anywhere in Georgia. No previous hospital experience listed. No references from a prior nursing position. Just a void. He had hired her himself, after she presented credentials that checked out, licenses valid, background clean, certifications current, but something about that empty 18 months bothered him. It was the kind of gap that suggested either institutional employment or the kind of employment you did not list on applications. The morning shift continued its careful dance. A patient in Bay 3 needed his blood pressure recheck. The ventilator in Bay 5 was triggering alarms that required adjustment. Megan moved from station to station, her movements economical and precise, never wasting a step, never raising her voice, never drawing attention. She was the kind of nurse who made the job look effortless, and that was exactly the problem. Effortless competence was threatening to men like Hargrove, who had built their authority on being indispensable. Megan made it look as though a patient could survive almost anything with her managing their care. At 11:13 a.m., she went to her locker in the staff break room. The room was empty, most of the day's shift was with patients. She spun the combination lock with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. 3 rotations left, 2 right, 1 left. The door swung open. Inside, her personal belongings occupied exactly 1 shelf. A water bottle. A protein bar she never ate. A phone charger coiled with military precision. And her jacket. Charcoal grey, purchased at a surplus store, unremarkable except for the lining. She reached for it, her fingers finding the small seam at the inside breast pocket. Behind the fabric, invisible unless you were looking for it, lay a patch. Faded, worn, maybe 2 inches square, embroidered with a symbol that meant nothing to anyone at Sacred Heart Hospital. But it meant everything to her. It meant 18 years. It meant Kandahar and Jalabad and 3 operations she could not name even to herself anymore. It meant the call sign Reaper 6, whispered in radio static by soldiers she had trained, soldiers who had bled out in her arms in places the news would never mention. She looked at it for 3 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Then she closed the locker door softly and returned to the ICU. Hargrove was already implementing the next phase. He had not consciously decided what that phase would be, the decision lived in him at the level of self-preservation, an immune response to a threat he sensed more than understood. At the nurse's station, he began a series of conversations with the staff. Nothing accusatory. Nothing direct. Just observations, mentioned casually, the way poison gets introduced into a well. To Jennifer, the charge nurse, he said, I've noticed some of the newer protocols O'Brien suggests are based on military medicine. Interesting approach, but this isn't a trauma center. To Todd, one of the residents, he said, that employment gap before she came here makes you wonder. To Patricia, the unit secretary, he mentioned that maybe someone should verify whether O'Brien's previous certifications had actually been maintained, just for the sake of the unit's credentialing file. These seeds were planted casually, over coffee, with a kind of tone that suggested Hargrove was simply being thorough, simply protecting the unit. He was competent at this. 23 years had taught him how to build narratives, how to make people question things without ever explicitly raising the question himself. By the time he finished with these conversations, something had shifted in the air around Megan. She still worked with the same precision, still saved lives with the same quiet competence, but now she was working in an atmosphere that had become subtly hostile. When she entered the break room, conversations ended. When she offered a suggestion in rounds, it was met with polite dismissal. When she stayed late to finish charting, people would walk past her station and exchange glances. She noticed. Of course she noticed. What she did not do was respond. Instead, she kept her shoulders level and her voice steady. She had learned, long ago, that the best way to weather an attack was to give the attacker nothing to aim at. No tears. No anger. No visible distress. Just the same methodical competence, the same quiet focus. Pain was information, and right now the information was clear. Something had changed in how this place perceived her. But she had survived worse than office politics. She had survived things that had left permanent marks on her body and temporary breaks in her mind. She could survive this. The day wore on. Shift change approached at 3 p.m. Megan finished her charting, double-checked her last patients, and prepared the unit for the incoming evening shift. In Bay 2, she adjusted the morphine drip down by 0.2 milliliters, watching the sedation scale improve. In Bay 4, she confirmed the antibiotics were infusing at the correct rate. In Bay 6, she placed a fresh ice pack on the post-op incision, whispering something to the patient that made him nod, made his shoulders relax. These small acts of competence accumulated like shadows, and Hargrove noticed every one of them from his office window. What happened next began quietly, the way the worst things often do. The hospital's afternoon administrator, Patricia Chen, received a call from Hargrove asking whether the unit's credentialing files had been properly updated. A routine question, routine response. But embedded in that routine was the suggestion that perhaps O'Brien's qualifications should be re-verified, just as a matter of protocol. Nothing accusatory. Nothing explicit. Just that seed, planted in the soil of bureaucracy where it could grow without scrutiny. By 3:53 p.m., before Megan had even clocked out, Hargrove was already in motion. He had learned that the best way to neutralize a threat was to begin building a case against it before the threat even understood it was being built. He pulled her file and reviewed every notation, every comment, looking for anything he could harvest into something larger. He found nothing concrete, which meant he would need to create it. He opened a new document on his computer and began writing. The words did not come easily at first, but they came. Concerns about her questioning of established protocols. Observations about her unusual approach to patient management. Questions about her previous employment history. Megan O'Brien clocked out at 4:27 p.m., collected her jacket from her locker, not looking at the patch this time, and walked to her car in the parking lot. The Savannah afternoon was hot, humid, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer. Her phone, silent all day, did not ring. No alerts. No messages. Just the quiet awareness that the safe harbor she had tried to build was developing a leak, and she had no way to plug it without revealing why she knew how to plug it in the first place. She started her car and drove home in silence. She sat in Bay 7, adjusting the morphine drip for a post-surgical patient whose wife stood rigid beside the bed, fingers locked around her husband's hand. The incision site looked clean. Vitals stable. Pain assessment 8 out of 10, which meant the current dosage wasn't holding. Megan calculated the next increment, a standard protocol, evidence-based, nothing reckless. She had the syringe ready when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the room like a blade through tissue. Nurse O'Brien. Not a question. A summoning. She turned, syringe still in hand. This is excessive pain management, he said, loud enough that a resident 2 beds over looked up from her chart. Are you trying to create addicts, or do you just not understand dosing protocols? His eyes were flat and satisfied, hunting for the reaction he'd already decided to find. The patient's wife gasped. The husband's jaw clenched. Megan took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only betrayal. She set the syringe on the tray with surgical precision and met his stare without flinching. A single tear escaped her left eye. Not from pain. From the effort of not speaking the truth she could have spoken. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgical laser. Pain is the 5th vital sign, doctor. I'm treating what I assess. Her voice came out like still water. Calm. Absolute. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She watched his face flush red, not from her logic, but from her refusal to be broken. He turned and walked away without another word, his expensive loafers clicking against the tile with sharp, angry emphasis. The patient's wife reached out and squeezed Megan's wrist. Thank you, she whispered. Megan nodded once and finished adjusting the morphine. The next morning, she arrived to find a bright yellow sheet posted on the unit board. Her name was on it. So was Hargrove's signature. Disciplinary action, documentation error, failure to follow chain of command. The dates were wrong. The chart references didn't exist. She had completed every single documentation entry perfectly. She remembered the patient's name, his vitals, the exact time she'd recorded them. All fabricated. All intentional. She read it 3 times, her jaw clenching harder with each word, her hands curling into fists that she deliberately relaxed. She didn't take it down. That would have given him the satisfaction of her anger. Instead, she walked to her locker, hung her jacket with the faded unit patch sewn secretly inside its lining, and returned to work. By noon, everyone on the unit had read the board. By 1 o'clock, the narrative had begun to mutate. Ghost Girl. That's what Hargrove was calling her now, in the hallway near the med dispensary where he knew his voice would carry. Just a nurse who was haunting the place, who didn't belong here, who was slow and sloppy and shouldn't have gotten licensed in the first place. The nickname spread like an infection. Ghost Girl. Appropriate for someone invisible until she made a mistake. During afternoon rounds, she sat in the break room with her lunch tray. A salad, water bottle, an apple. She'd eaten here 5 times a week for 3 years without incident. Today, within 30 seconds of her sitting down, 3 nurses stood and left without speaking. A 4th who remained whispered to her companion just loud enough for Megan to hear, "That's Ghost Girl. Always so quiet. Like she's haunting the place." Megan's hands remained steady around her fork. Her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She ate every bite of that salad and drank the entire water bottle, her body refusing to grant him the concession of her appetite failing. When she finished, she threw away her trash, rinsed her container, and walked out without acknowledging anyone. 2 hours later, Hargrove cornered her at the medication dispensary. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. His shadow fell across her face as he stepped close enough to invade her space, a calculated dominance play. "You're slow," he said. "You're sloppy." He paused, letting the word sit. "And frankly, Ghost Girl, I'm not sure how you got licensed in the first place." She didn't move. Didn't speak. The dispensary was empty except for them. This was deliberate. He'd waited for her to be alone. She took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist, her eyes locked on his without a flicker of surrender. "I've seen what real failure looks like, doctor, and this isn't it." The words came out in a voice that made the air pressure change. Not angry. Worse than angry. The kind of composure that comes from commands given to soldiers in kill zones, from decisions made under fire, from knowing what real stakes looked like. His face went pale. For a moment, she watched him realize he had no idea who he was standing next to. Then she walked away, her posture perfect, her pace neither hurried nor slow. Professional. Dismissive. She could feel his eyes on her back all the way down the corridor, but she didn't turn around. What happened next didn't just isolate her, it ended her career at Sacred Heart. That evening, a new patient arrived in Bay for via ambulance. Marcus Chen, 34, scarred from old combat wounds, admitted for pneumonia complicated by shrapnel fragments lodged near his left lung that no surgeon had ever attempted to remove. The risk outweighed the benefit. Megan took his intake vitals with the routine efficiency she brought to every patient. Blood pressure stable. Oxygen saturation acceptable. Heart rate elevated but expected given the infection. She checked his chest tube insertion site, examining the sutures with clinical precision. Her fingers moved with a fluency that went beyond standard nursing training, the muscle memory of field surgeries in Kandahar, of working under fire, of knowing exactly how much pressure to apply without causing additional trauma. Her hands had held bleeding soldiers together. A chest tube was nothing. Chen's eyes followed her movements. She felt his attention the way a predator feels the weight of another predator's stare. "You're military," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, breath labored, but absolute in its certainty. Megan's hand froze for exactly half a second. She pressed a finger to her lips, not a threat, a request, and continued working in silence. She didn't acknowledge the question. Didn't look at his face. But her heart slammed against her ribs as she adjusted his oxygen tubing and stepped back from the bed. That night, Chen lay in the darkened bay, his phone illuminated in the quiet hours after midnight. He pulled up his browser with trembling fingers and searched decade-old deployment records, cross-referencing female Special Forces medics who had operated in Kandahar between 2011 and 2015. The search results were sparse. Most records were redacted. But he remembered a call sign whispered in the intelligence briefing before a classified operation. Reaper 6. The woman who had extracted a wounded SEAL from a compound in Paktia province with nothing but a rifle and surgical training. The woman who disappeared from military records entirely in 2016. He looked at a photograph on his phone, a roster from his regiment, and tried to match faces. One name kept surfacing when he searched public records. One name connected to a hospital in Savannah, Georgia, where a nurse named Megan O'Brien had been hired 3 years ago with a suspiciously sparse employment history. He reached for his phone to make a call that would change everything. Meanwhile, in his office at Sacred Heart, Dr. Hargrove reviewed Megan's personnel file again, his jaw clenched with the frustration of being defied. He picked up his office phone and dialed 3 of the numbers listed under previous employers. Disconnected. Disconnected. And then one that rang through to a voicemail box that was no longer accepting messages. He tried a 4th number. A man answered, listened to his inquiry about Megan O'Brien's employment history, and responded with only, "We can confirm she worked here. That's all I can tell you." Hargrove hung up. He opened his desk drawer and removed a business card, a private investigator named Mercer who owed him favors from a custody case he'd testified in 5 years ago. He dialed the number and left a message, "I need you to dig into someone." A nurse. Sparse background, employment gaps, and something about her doesn't add up. 2 weeks. That's your timeline. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the machinery he'd set in motion. In her locker, Megan stood alone during her final break of the shift. The faded Special Forces unit patch was sewn inside the jacket lining, hidden from the casual eye. She touched it once, her fingers tracing the worn stitching. She remembered Kandahar. She remembered the weight of a rifle. She remembered the sound of rotors cutting the desert air. She remembered the faces of soldiers she had pulled back from the edge of death and the ones she hadn't been fast enough to save. 3 years ago, she had tried to bury all of that. A new name on applications, blank spaces where military service should have gone, a deliberate reconstruction of Megan O'Brien as someone forgettable. Someone who could heal without being haunted by knowing how to destroy. The ghost had found her anyway. Marcus Chen arrived by ambulance at 11:56 p.m. on a Tuesday, his weathered frame moving slowly across the threshold into Bay 4 like a man accustomed to carrying weight that had nothing to do with his body. Pneumonia complicated by old shrapnel wounds, that's what the paramedics reported. That's what the chart said. But his eyes told a different story. They scanned the ICU with the methodical precision of someone who had survived things that killed most people, and they lingered on Megan as she approached his stretcher to verify vitals. 72 years old. 5'9". Scarred hands that looked like they'd been through a meat grinder and reassembled by someone who didn't have all the pieces. His left shoulder bore the white lattice of shrapnel damage, the kind that came from IEDs in the Sanjan Valley, from Kandahar, from places where men learn to compartmentalize pain the way other people learn to tie their shoes. The admission paperwork identified him as a combat medic. 75th Ranger Regiment. 23 years of service. 2 Purple Hearts. Retired. He watched her work. That's what struck her first, not his wounds or his diagnosis, but the way his eyes tracked her hands as she hung the saline bag, as she checked the ventilator settings, as she positioned the ultrasound probe against his chest wall during routine imaging. His breathing came shallow, rattled, the pneumonia stealing oxygen from his blood in increments that the monitor translated into numbers, O2 sat dropping from 88 to 84 to 82. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, noted it clinically. Megan noted it the way she'd learned to note things in a Kandahar field hospital, as intelligence, as data, as the difference between a patient who woke up and one who didn't. 3 days passed. Medications, chest tube positioning, supplemental oxygen climbing incrementally upward. Marcus improved on the surface. His fever broke. His cough became less violent. But on Thursday afternoon, when Megan performed the routine chest tube assessment, his hand reached out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength, and he whispered, "You're military." It wasn't a question. Her hand stilled. The 14-gauge angiocath needle hung suspended above the insertion site. Around them, the ICU continued its orchestrated chaos, monitors beeping their steady rhythms, ventilators whooshing their mechanical breaths, nurses calling out vitals from other bays. The fluorescent ceiling panels cast their relentless clinical light across the sterile field. But in that moment, in the small radius of Marcus Chen's gaze and Megan's still hands, the world had become very quiet indeed. She pressed one finger to her lips. A single gesture. Not confirmation. Not denial. Just a request for silence, the kind that passes between people who understand that some truths live better in darkness than in light. She continued the procedure as if he hadn't spoken. Her hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times, in triage tents and forward operating bases and places where the distinction between nurse and combat medic blurred into irrelevance. The needle went in. The catheter seated. She secured it with practiced efficiency, and Marcus Chen released her wrist and closed his eyes and never mentioned it again. But he watched her for the next 2 days. Whenever she entered the bay, his eyes opened. Whenever she was near, his breathing seemed to regulate itself. It was as if some deep part of him, the part that had survived 3 tours and 17 combat operations, recognized something in her that transcended the white nursing scrubs and the badge and the careful neutrality of her face. And then Tuesday night arrived in the form of an alarm. The monitors in Bay 4 started screaming at 9:34 p.m. A single sustained tone, not the staccato pattern of a dropped oxygen saturation, but the high-pitched wail of a patient in active distress. Megan was in Bay 2 documenting a medication administration when her head snapped toward the sound. She moved. No deliberation. No consultation. Just movement, the kind that comes from muscle memory deeper than thought, from 18 years of responding to the sound that meant a life was ending. Marcus Chen's monitors painted a picture of catastrophe. Heart rate 164. Blood pressure 78/44 and dropping. The waveform on the EKG showed electrical chaos, the rhythm disorganizing itself into something that wasn't quite fibrillation but was heading that direction with the inevitability of a stone rolling downhill. His chest rose and fell in gasps that the ventilator was only partially supporting. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of profound shock. Dr. Morrison arrived within seconds, his face cycling through confusion as he tried to read the clinical picture. "Get me a stat cardiothoracic consult," he ordered, his voice carrying the edge of someone trying to maintain control while confronting something outside his expertise. "And prep for possible emergency thoracotomy." Megan was already moving. Not waiting for orders. Not asking for permission. The attending physician was 17 years her senior with credentials that outranked her education by a margin of credentialed hierarchy and institutional authority. But he was staring at the monitors the way a man stares at a problem he doesn't know how to solve, and Megan knew, with the absolute certainty that came from having been the only qualified person in a medical tent 200 kilometers from the nearest functioning hospital, that waiting for cardiothoracic surgery meant watching a man code on a stretcher while people stood around holding empty protocols. "It's tamponade," she said. Not a question. Not a suggestion. A statement delivered in a voice like still water. Pericardiums filling. Pressures collapsing the ventricles. Morrison looked at her. The kind of look that contained confusion and the faint beginning of understanding and the recognition that something had shifted in the room. "I need an 18-gauge needle," Megan continued, already moving toward the crash cart. "Ultrasound probe, sterile prep, and someone to monitor vitals." "A nurse doesn't perform pericardiocentesis," Morrison said, but his voice had lost its certainty. It was the tone of a man stating a rule he no longer believed in. Megan had the ultrasound probe positioned under Marcus Chen's left ribcage. She'd already palpated the landmarks, the xiphoid process, the angle of approach, the space between ribs where a needle could slide toward the pericardial sac without encountering lung tissue. She was prepping the skin with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell sharp and clean in the recycled hospital air, and she was moving like a woman who had performed this procedure in a Kandahar triage tent at 03 for 7 hours with mortar rounds detonating 3 blocks away and a patient bleeding out from shrapnel that had torn through his diaphragm and his pericardium both. The 18-gauge angiocath needle slid in at a precise angle, advancing beneath the xiphoid process, the ultrasound probe tracking its progress. Blood pressure was down to 62/32. Marcus Chen's consciousness was narrowing to a point. The monitor showed the electrical activity of a heart being strangled by its own pericardial fluid. The needle reached the pericardial sac. She felt the resistance change, that subtle difference in tissue density that meant she'd found the target. She advanced the catheter, withdrew the needle, and blood came back through the hub. Not arterial blood. Not the bright crimson of fresh oxygen-carrying cells. The darker maroon of pericardial effusion, 120 milliliters, then more, spilling through the catheter into the collection chamber as the pressure around Marcus Chen's heart released itself like a breath finally exhaled. The monitors responded. The waveform steadied. The heart rate dropped from 164 to 128. The blood pressure climbed, 72/40, then 88/51, then 101/64. The patient's color began to shift from ashen to something approximating human. His breathing, previously desperate and chaotic, synchronized with the ventilator's rhythm like a musician finding the beat they'd been searching for. Dr. Morrison was staring. Not with anger. With something closer to awe. With the expression of a man watching someone perform a procedure that fell clearly outside the legal scope of a registered nurse, performed with the kind of precision that suggested not rule-breaking but mastery. He stepped back. Not in challenge. In deference. Megan secured the catheter with tape, her movements deliberately unhurried now that the crisis had passed, documenting the procedure time, 9:37 p.m., the volume removed, 122 milliliters, the patient's response. The ICU settled around them, other staff realizing that the code had been averted, that whatever had just happened in Bay 4 had ended with a patient still breathing and a monitor showing the steady rhythm of sinus. But Dr. Hargrove arrived at 9:51 p.m., summoned by a unit clerk who'd flagged the emergency. His face moved through stages. First confusion as he reviewed the chart. Then the slow hardening of his expression as he recognized what had occurred. A nurse. Not a physician. A procedure that should have required cardiothoracic expertise. A life saved by someone outside the institutional hierarchy he had carefully constructed to ensure his dominance within it. He didn't say anything. Not in the ICU bay where other staff could hear. But his eyes found Megan's for a moment, a look that contained recognition and something else. Something that looked like calculation. The kind of calculation a man makes when he understands that the threat he's been working to neutralize has just demonstrated a level of competence that makes neutralization not merely desirable but absolutely necessary. He turned and walked to his office. Megan watched him go, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her face revealing nothing of what she understood with absolute clarity. The procedure she'd just performed had not saved a life. It had ended her career. By every institutional measure, every scope limitation, every credential-based hierarchy that governed medical practice in America, she had committed an unforgivable violation. She had exceeded her authority. She had succeeded brilliantly. And both facts were now equally damning. By the time she finished charting at 11:08 p.m., Hargrove had already made his first phone call to Richard Westbrook, the board member with whom he had covered up a 2008 malpractice case that would have cost the hospital $500,000 in settlement fees. By midnight, he'd called Patricia Mills at the State Nursing Board, his voice carrying the weight of concerned professionalism. "I need to report a serious scope violation." It occurred at 9:37 p.m. in the ICU. By 12:43 a.m., his investigator friend had received a text message with a single directive: find everything on O'Brien now. Employment gaps. Background discrepancies. Anything. In Bay 4, Marcus Chen lay on the ventilator with 122 milliliters of blood no longer compressing his heart, and he watched the hallway where Megan had disappeared into the night shift, and he reached for his phone with a hand that had learned long ago to dial numbers in the dark. The voice that answered was crisp and immediate, marked by the kind of military bearing that suggested someone trained to respond to emergency notifications at any hour. Marcus Chen spoke 3 words, a call sign from a decade ago, from deployment records that should have been classified, from a past that was supposed to stay buried. "I found her." Dr. Hargrove stood in his office at 6:24 a.m., the morning sun bleeding through the Venetian blinds in gold bars across his mahogany desk. His hands were already moving. 3 phone calls. That's all it would take. The first call went to board member Harrison Sterling, whose daughter had benefited from Hargrove's letter of recommendation to Johns Hopkins. "Harrison, we have a serious problem. One of our nurses performed an invasive procedure yesterday without attending physician authorization. Cardiac tamponade case. Pericardiocentesis. She didn't wait for my order." A pause. No prior authorization. Just did it. The patient lived, but protocol exists for a reason. We need to document this at the highest level. Sterling's voice came back tight, grateful. "I'll call Patricia Mills at the board. We'll flag this." The second call was to Dr. Conrad Bancroft, the hospital's chief financial officer, who had once borrowed $30,000 from Hargrove's investment fund at favorable terms. "Conrad, I need your support on a personnel matter. That ICU nurse, Megan O'Brien, just overstepped her entire scope of practice. Unauthorized interventions. We have documentation. I'm filing a formal complaint with the state board." Bancroft didn't hesitate. "I'm with you. What do you need? Keep it quiet until the paperwork is filed. I don't want her claiming retaliation." The third call was different. Quieter. Hargrove lowered his voice even though his office door was closed. "This is Dr. Hargrove at Sacred Heart in Savannah. I need to speak with Detective William Graves about a personnel investigation." 20 seconds of hold music. Then a voice like gravel in a cement mixer answered. "Graves here. Detective, I have information about an employee. 3-year employment gap. No social media footprint prior to 2020. Suddenly appears with surgical-level competence in trauma care. I need to know if she has a sealed record. Witness protection. Prior charges. Whatever you can find." Graves wrote something down. "I'll make some calls. This is off the books." "Entirely," Hargrove said. "She's a threat to patient safety." By 8:15 a.m., the formal complaint had been typed and submitted to the State Board of Nursing, each word chosen to wound, reckless practice outside established scope. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Lack of proper supervision. Patient safety risk. The letterhead gleamed. Hargrove's signature was pristine. By 9:33 a.m., Megan was called into HR. Janet Simmons' face was apologetic but resolved, the expression of someone following orders from above. "Megan, I'm sorry. You're being placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. There's been a complaint filed with the state board regarding a procedure you performed yesterday without prior authorization." Megan's jaw tightened but her voice remained level. The patient was in cardiac tamponade. The attending physician was 8 minutes away. "I understand," Janet said, her hands folded tightly on her desk. "But you performed a procedure that's typically reserved for physicians." "Yes. I'm aware." Megan stood. Her voice had dropped an octave. "I saved his life." "That may be true, but protocol. Protocol doesn't save people. Skills do. Knowledge does." Megan walked to the door. "When's the hearing?" 2 weeks. Legal will contact you." Security was waiting in the corridor. Not unkindly, but present. A guard named Thompson, whom she'd once helped after he'd injured his shoulder, wouldn't meet her eyes. He escorted her to her locker. She retrieved her jacket. The faded unit patch sewn inside its lining felt heavier than it had this morning. From his office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Hargrove watched her cross the parking lot. She didn't rush. Didn't break. She moved like someone who had already survived worse, which made him grip the windowsill harder. She should have been devastated. Pleading. Instead, she simply got into her grey Subaru and drove away, her brake lights disappearing into morning traffic. The drive home was 73 minutes of silence. Megan's hands were steady on the wheel but her mind was fracturing. She'd spent 3 years building an identity that couldn't survive scrutiny. 3 years assuming that if she kept her head down, moved carefully, spoke softly, the past would stay buried. But saving lives left evidence. Competence was a signature. You couldn't pull someone back from cardiac arrest without people asking how you learned to do that. The house was quiet when she arrived. Emma was at school. Megan sat at the kitchen table in her street clothes, jeans, a blue sweater, no scrubs to mark her as anyone, and didn't move for 3 hours. At 2:13 p.m., the front door opened. Emma's backpack hit the floor first. Then her voice, "Mom? Why are you?" She stopped. Her daughter stood in the doorway, her 16-year-old brain registering the impossible, her mother, the strongest person she knew, sitting motionless at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face in daylight. Emma had seen her mother tired, frustrated, angry at the news. But never like this. Never broken. "Mom, why are you home?" Emma's voice was small. Frightened. The voice of a child suddenly aware that the foundation beneath her was made of something shakier than she'd believed. Megan couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. She couldn't tell her daughter that she'd saved a man's life and been suspended for it. She couldn't explain the skills that had saved Marcus Chen because they belonged to a woman named Reaper 6, and that woman wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She couldn't tell Emma that sometimes when you pull people back from the edge, the world decides you're too dangerous to keep around. Emma moved across the kitchen and sat beside her mother, gripping her hand like she was the adult now, like her small fingers could hold together something that was coming apart. They sat like that, mother and daughter, one broken and one terrified by the breaking, while the afternoon light moved across the table. That evening, in a hospital room 3 floors below where he'd coded, Marcus Chen lay in his bed and made a phone call. His voice was steady but his hands trembled as he dialed. When someone answered, he spoke 3 words carefully, each one a key turning in a lock that couldn't be undone. "I found her." The voice on the other end was silent for so long that Chen thought the line had died. Then, "Say that again." Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. Works at Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah. Saved my life yesterday. Performed an emergency pericardiocentesis while I was coding. Textbook execution. No hesitation. More silence. Then, confirm her call sign. Chen's voice dropped. Reaper 6. I recognized her hands. The way she moved. Exactly the same as Kandahar. A pause. She's been here 3 years. Civilian work. Under her own name. The voice came back different now, urgent, professional. Stay on the line. I'm activating protocols. Chen heard typing, low voices, the sound of a machine waking up. At JSOC headquarters in North Carolina, files that had been sealed for 7 years began moving through encrypted channels. Personnel records. Service records. Incident reports from Kandahar. Medical clearances. Psychological evaluations. Someone typed Reaper 6 into a secure database and what emerged was a ghost, a woman who had been officially discharged 3 years ago with full honors and a medical pension due to PTSD, a woman whose name belonged to classified operations, a woman who was supposed to be rebuilding her life in anonymity. A phone call was placed to a man named Commander James Pierce. "Sir, we have a situation. Reaper 6 just surfaced. She's a civilian nurse in Georgia. She's been exposed at her workplace. The exposure may have been deliberate." Back in Savannah, Dr. Hargrove met with Detective Graves in a coffee shop at the hospital's edge. Graves slid a folder across the table, his weathered face betraying nothing. "Thin," he said. 3-year gap. No criminal record. No sealed juvenile. No witness protection markers. What about federal? Hargrove asked. Graves' jaw tightened. "That's as far as I can dig. Anything past that, you'd need someone at the Bureau. Whatever she's hiding, it's protected." Hargrove's fingers drummed against the table, a small tell of his frustration. "The disciplinary hearing is in 14 days. I need the nursing board to understand that she's unstable. Unpredictable. That employment gap could indicate psychological issues, untreated trauma, anything. Graves gathered his papers. You want me to speculate in writing? I want the board to ask questions she can't answer. Graves stood. You're playing a dangerous game, Doctor. Hargrove didn't look up. I'm protecting the hospital. But in the darkened living room of her home, Megan O'Brien held the faded unit patch, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining the night she'd left the service, the one that read JSOC Task Force 121 in letters barely visible beneath faded stitching, and felt the walls closing in. Anonymity had always been temporary. Competence always left traces. You couldn't hold lives together without someone eventually noticing that your hands knew exactly where to grip, exactly how much pressure, exactly when to push and when to wait. She'd thought she could be just a nurse. She'd been wrong. 2 weeks. That's how long until the hearing. 2 weeks until someone asked a question she couldn't answer without unraveling the entire careful construction of her new life. That night, Marcus Chen sat in his hospital room with his phone pressed against his ear, his voice dropping to a whisper that belonged to a different life. I think I just met Reaper 6, he said into the darkness. The voice on the other end, someone at JSOC he'd known only from deployment records and classified briefings, went absolutely silent. 30 seconds stretched like an hour. Then, confirm location and status. Marcus gave coordinates. A name. A hospital floor. By dawn, networks activated that Megan O'Brien thought she'd burned to ash 3 years ago. Wheels began turning in rooms with no windows. Calls were placed on secured lines. Files were pulled from archives marked inactive, do not disturb. A captain at Naval Special Warfare Command read a personnel jacket and whispered, Reaper 6 is alive. The machinery of the military doesn't move fast, it moves with the precision of someone who has all the time they need and absolutely no mercy. 2 weeks crawled past. Megan received a certified letter, disciplinary hearing, Sacred Heart Hospital conference room, Tuesday 10 a.m. sharp. Dr. Hargrove's name was listed as the complainant. Her hands didn't shake when she read it. That was worse than if they had. The conference room at Sacred Heart Hospital filled with people Dr. Hargrove had not invited and could not control. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face arranged in the expression of a man who still believed he was winning. Behind him, his attorney, a thin nervous man named Feldstein who'd already begun calculating the cost of what was about to unfold. The board members sat in stiff rows. The state nursing board representative had her folder open. A hospital administrator fidgeted with her pen. Then the doors opened. Megan's daughter Emma walked in first, 15 years old, her jaw set like her mother's, wearing a blazer that was too big for her but which she wore like armor. She took a seat in the front row. The room shifted. Children don't belong in these rooms. Children shouldn't be here. But Emma was here, and her presence changed the mathematics of everything that was about to happen. Behind her came 3 people in dress uniform. The first was a barrel-chested man with silver dolphins pinned over his left breast pocket, Commander James Pierce, SEAL Team Liaison to the hospital network. The second was an older woman in the dress uniform of the Naval Nurse Corps, her shoulders heavy with rank. The third was a photographer, official Navy credentials hanging from his neck. Hargrove's attorney stood up. I don't think civilians are. Pierce cut him off with a single look. Not a gesture? Not a word. A look like a door slamming shut on a hand. The attorney sat back down. The nurse administrator, Patricia Mills, 23 years at Sacred Heart, opened a folder that had arrived via Federal Courier that morning. Her voice shook as she began to read. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. Kandahar Province, 2014 through 2016. During Operation Enduring Freedom, citation for Valor. Patricia's hands trembled. She was reading from a personnel file that didn't exist in any hospital system, that belonged to another world, another life, another version of a woman who'd tried to disappear. Emergency field surgery performed on 17 occasions. 0 mortality rate despite 72% critical injury classification. Patricia's voice cracked on the next words. Bronze Star with Valor, awarded for treatment under enemy fire, Kandahar Province, March 2015. She paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain drumming against the windows outside, the sky above Savannah opening up like a wound. Commander Pierce stood. The movement alone, smooth, controlled, the motion of a man who'd moved through dangerous spaces his entire adult life, made Hargrove lean back in his chair. "I'm Commander James Pierce, Naval Special Warfare Command Liaison. I'm here to testify that the allegations against Senior Chief O'Brien are baseless, malicious, and in direct violation of federal whistleblower protections under 10 U.S.C. 1034. Pierce's voice moved like armor plating, each word a shield. Senior Chief served with distinction. 3 consecutive tours. Multiple commendations. He paused. The silence was surgical. Purple Heart. Patricia read it from her folder. The room absorbed the word like water into sand. Joint Service Commendation Medal. Another pause. Pierce's presence made the air pressure change, as if gravity itself had shifted. And a silver star. The final words came out like a closing fist. Silver Star. The 3rd highest military decoration. Fewer than 100 awarded each year across all branches of the United States military. The room understood what it meant even if most of them couldn't name it. It meant Megan O'Brien had done something that changed the calculus of battles, of lives, of wars. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. His attorney whispered something. Hargrove didn't answer. Emma O'Brien, 15 years old and sitting in the front row of a conference room in a hospital in Savannah, Georgia, turned to look directly at Dr. Hargrove. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eye said everything her mother's composure never would. The hearing dissolved after that. Not officially, the board chairman called for a 15-minute recess, but everyone knew it was over. Hargrove gathered his papers with hands that had stopped obeying him. His attorney was already calling someone on his phone, his voice tight with the particular panic of a man watching his career exit through a side door he hadn't known existed. That night, at 11:19 p.m., Dr. Hargrove sat in his office with the door locked and the lights off, illuminated only by the glow of his computer screen. His hands moved across the keyboard with the jerky, desperate efficiency of someone who understands, finally, that the ground beneath his feet is collapsing. Email after email. Messages to board members who'd promised him support but who would burn him the moment the politics shifted. Communications with the private investigator, the ones that said things like anything we can use, I don't care how you get it. Notes about fabricated documentation errors, about protocols he'd invented to justify the write-up, about strategies to isolate Megan from her colleagues. Delete. 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 His trash folder filling like a grave. His browser history being erased by someone who thought they were being invisible. Hargrove's breath came in short gasps. The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart were 8 stories below him, and somewhere in this hospital, people were still being healed by a nurse he'd tried to destroy. What Hargrove didn't know, what no one had told him, was that Tom Rodriguez, the hospital's IT director, had been watching for 3 weeks. Tom was a Marine Corps veteran, 2 tours through Fallujah during the surge, and he recognized the particular smell of a cover-up the way a bloodhound recognizes prey. He'd been documenting Hargrove's file access, preserving every deleted email through the server backup system, capturing security footage of Hargrove's 11:08 p.m. deletion spree. Tom had the patience of someone who'd once waited 36 hours in a drainage ditch. He could wait for the right moment. At 9:44 p.m. the next morning, not that night, but the next day, because Tom understood that timing mattered in evidence gathering just like it mattered in ambush, Tom forwarded a complete package to the State Medical Board, the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, and the hospital's Board of Directors. The subject line was Spare, Fraud and Retaliation, Dr. Hargrove. Within 72 hours, 3 simultaneous investigations launched. Board member Richard Westbrook, whose phone calls to Hargrove had been preserved in email, decided to cooperate and provide testimony in exchange for immunity. The private investigator submitted his communications with Hargrove, which made it clear that the investigation had been directed by someone with institutional authority to misuse hospital resources. Patricia Mills from the nursing board, her hands still shaking from reading the confidential personnel file, formally recused herself and disclosed every conversation she'd had with Hargrove before the hearing. The walls moved inward on Hargrove from every direction. His attorney called with a voice like someone reading an obituary. "The evidence is overwhelming," the attorney said. "Witness tampering. Abuse of authority. Falsification of personnel records. Violation of federal whistleblower protections. They're talking about criminal charges, not just license revocation." By Thursday, the hospital board had demanded his resignation. By Friday, the state medical board opened formal license revocation proceedings. His wife left over the weekend, taking their children to her sister's house in Atlanta. Hargrove sat in his emptying office, staring at framed diplomas from Yale and Johns Hopkins, at pictures of himself shaking hands with hospital CEOs, at the physical evidence of a career that had taken 23 years to build and 3 weeks to demolish. The smell of his office, the particular combination of leather chairs and furniture polish and the ghost of expensive cologne, suddenly seemed like the smell of a tomb. 6 months later, Megan O'Brien walked through the doors of Sacred Heart Hospital wearing the title of Clinical Director of the ICU. The board of directors, in a unanimous vote that took less than 30 minutes, had appointed her to the position. She had a corner office on the 9th floor with windows that looked out over Forsyth Park and the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees like the ghosts of all the decisions that had led her here. The faded Special Forces unit patch, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining for 3 years, now hung framed above her desk. No longer hidden. No longer something to be ashamed of. No longer a secret. It was a reminder of who she was and what she'd survived and why she was never, ever going to be invisible again. Emma sat in the office after school, doing her calculus homework at the small table while her mother reviewed ICU protocols and staffing schedules. They didn't talk much about what had happened. They didn't need to. Emma had seen her mother stand in that conference room while the room itself transformed into something holy because of the truth. That was enough. Marcus Chen attended the ceremony where Megan introduced new trauma care protocols, something she called the Field Expedient System, based on the combat medicine techniques she'd used in Kandahar. It would change how Sacred Heart treated multiple trauma patients and multisystem failure. It would save lives. 17 miles away, at a strip mall in the industrial district outside Savannah, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table outside a payday loan office. His shirt was cheap polyester, embroidered with West Side Insurance in thread that was already unraveling. His medical license was permanently revoked. The fraud charges had resulted in 3 years probation, a $47,000 fine, and the knowledge that his name would appear in professional databases forever as a physician who'd lost his license due to misconduct. People walked past without looking at him. Not because they were avoiding him, though some were, but because he was invisible now in a way Megan O'Brien had never been. He was invisible because he mattered to no one, because his presence changed nothing, because he was a man without a purpose trying to sell insurance policies to people who couldn't afford them. A former colleague from Sacred Heart, one of the orthopedic surgeons, spotted him one afternoon and quickly looked away, the kind of look that contains pity and disgust in equal measure. Hargrove watched her go. He didn't try to call out. He didn't try to explain. What was there to explain? At Sacred Heart, during a staff meeting in the ICU, Commander Pierce presented Megan with a plaque. The inscription read, "For service above and beyond, in 2 uniforms, in 2 wars, 1 foreign, 1 here at home." The ICU staff, the same nurses and techs who'd once left the break room when she sat down, rose in a standing ovation. Megan stood at the podium, her voice steady, her posture erect in a way that suggested bone and muscle and the particular kind of strength that comes from having survived impossible things. "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns," she said. The rain outside drummed against the windows. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, getting closer. Megan moved toward the trauma bay with the same quiet competence that once made her invisible, now recognized for exactly what it is, excellence forged in fire. The pericardiocentesis kit was already laid out. Her hands moved on their own. The muscle memory of another life, another version of herself, had finally become the thing that would define her future. Subscribe for more stories about the people we underestimate. Like this video if you believe honor can't stay hidden. And comment, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?